The Separation of Races by John Lukacs from The Passing of the Modern Age, copyright 1970. The Separation of Races. How, after the abolition of slavery and the enforcement of equality, the races have discovered that their fraternity amounted to little. One of the strangest elements of human nature, certainly one of the most mysterious components of the unity of mankind, is the existence of various races. During the present phase of our mental evolution, the realization of what this diversity means has not yet emerged from the depths of our minds to the surfaces of our consciousness. On the one hand, the reaction of large masses of people to their confrontation with problems of race are still primitive and fearful. On the other hand, it was hardly more than 100 years ago that the first attempts were made to confront the problem of the diversity of races on the higher basis of detached intellectual study. But none of these attempts, whether by racialists or anti-racialists, have left us with anything but a sense of shameful and confused inadequacy. At the end of the modern age, the coexistence of peoples of different races within certain regions of the earth, often within the same country, has suddenly become problematic, and the pattern of world settlement that was characteristic of the last 500 years seems either halted or reversed. People sometimes think that race, as distinct from heredity, played no part in the savage animosities of the Christian Middle Ages. But this is not so. No matter how truly revolutionary the doctrines of Christianity were by virtue of its proclamation of a faith that was potentially open to slaves as well as to masters, to our remote ancestors, race and physical heredity meant much of the same thing. Even a superficial acquaintance with the history of the Spanish Inquisition tells us, for example, how the popular hatred for Jews and Moors in Spain involved more than the profession of religion, that a narrow and fanatical preoccupation with the potential evils of alien blood pursued the troubled descendants of the sincerest conversos for centuries. Still, nowhere outside of Europe were whites to be found 500 years ago. The white race then discovered other continents, inhabited, sometimes sparsely, by other races. The racial geography of the world was transformed. In the course of 4 centuries, 100 million white people migrated across the oceans. They conquered 4 continents. They settled North America, Siberia, Australia, which were harboring a few million people of primitive races. In Central and South America, they mixed with large numbers of the natives. In Africa and Asia, in their capacity of a superior and governing minority, they ruled vast lands and large peoples. This expansion of the empires of white nations reached its peak as late as 70 years ago, when, for example, all of Africa, save for 2 weak native states, was a colony of one or another European nation. Doubts were beginning to rise about the benefits of colonialism and about the validity of imperialism among the peoples of the white nations themselves. But their prestige was still high. All of the peoples of the world, possibly even those Chinese and Japanese who pretended the contrary, envied and emulated them. A little more than 50 years ago, this was beginning to change. The Japanese proved, for instance, that they could defeat Russians, Frenchmen, Englishmen, to the point of humiliation, even though they were to be defeated by the Americans in turn. The abject surrender to the Japanese of the rabbit-toothed British commander in Singapore in 1942 was a significant event, though it made probably a deeper impression upon the consciousness of a generation of Englishmen than upon East Asians. For more important than the ups and downs in the contests of states were the mutations of beliefs. After the Second World War, few Europeans still thought that the nations of the white race ought to rule over other races of the world. The 2 new superpowers, burdened as they were by the presence of various races in their midst, were propagandists of anti-imperialism, each in its own way. Then the diminished European powers discovered belatedly that their possessions of overseas colonies cost them more than what they were worth. Thus, they rapidly liquidated their empires within a few years, and, save for Siberia, South Africa, and a few small exceptions here and there, the political supremacy of the white race in Africa and Asia came to an end. This meant the end of a great period in the history of the world, of the vast movement of the European race to the vast lands across the seas that had begun 500 years before. But it was the beginning, too, of something else, of an increasing consciousness of what the coexistence of different races might really portend. The coexistence of races in the United States is an example of this. Hatred among people of different races, and the subjection of one race by another, exist, of course, in many other places in the world. Indeed, its worst instances are often practiced by one colored race against another. But I must write about the United States, because I am concerned with what is happening within Western civilization, among the components of which the continent of Europe is relatively fortunate, inhabited, as it is, by different nations which are, however, all whites. More than a century ago, the peoples and the governments of the Old World had chosen to put an end to slavery in their colonies and dominions, even before the peoples of the New World were to do so. During the obscure evolution of the history of South and Central America, the aspirations and conflicts of different races and their mixtures were the profoundest of elements. In North America, too, the key to the Civil War in the 19th century was race, and not politics or economics. Had the slaves in the southern states not been black, they would have been freed long before. Indeed, they would not have been slaves at all. Nevertheless, freed they were, at the cost of a murderous war between their white masters. During the following 100 years, it became more and more evident that the legal emancipation of the black race was not enough. It had put an end to one great evil while the evolution of society was creating others, because of the same principal element in the revolution of its consciousness that we have encountered earlier and that we shall encounter again. I am speaking of the shortcomings of egalitarian democracy and of the increasing internalization of the human condition. During the century that passed since the abolition of slavery in the United States, the animosity between the two races of the American people has not decreased. Alas, in many places probably the contrary is true. Not only were Negroes subject again to all kinds of legal restrictions, principally in the southern states, even when these too were abolished, the Negroes found that the hostility of many of their white neighbors was as strong, if not stronger, than before. When they migrated to the northern states, they were confronted by an insensitive and callous quality of industrial life that to them was new. They exchanged a condition of inequality that had been tempered by the reality of human contacts in the South for a legal condition of equality in the North, where the personal relations of the races were often abstract and inhuman. The main shortcoming of democracy facing the Negro race in the United States is not illiberality, it is abstraction. When we consider the Negro's lives, the traditional conservative warnings to the effect that an undue extension of equality results in a diminution of liberty means little. Their sufferings have existed, rather, because equality is often but a legal category, so narrow as to leave the essence of personal relationships unaffected, entirely different from those feelings of fraternity which, as Peggy wrote, have animated great men and great nations, whereas the desire for equality had only inspired very dubious revolutions. The intellectual consensus of our times still believes, or rather, it pretends to believe, that through their economic improvements, the dissatisfaction of the Negroes will diminish and perhaps even disappear. and that, with the growth of democratic education and legislation, the two races will eventually mingle and mix to such an extent that they will no longer remain separate entities. Both of these liberal projections have already proven woefully wrong. The legal prohibition of segregation, declared, alas, on the basis of a woozy sociological argumentation by the Philistine justices of the Supreme Court of the United States, probably overdue by 1954, was proclaimed at the very time when the de facto segregation of the two races was crystallizing across the country. Since that time, actual segregation may have proceeded faster than desegregation. There are virtually no whites who still live in Harlem or in other Negro sections of American cities. Public schools with Negro majorities are close to becoming all Negro schools. Democratic education, at any rate, has meant nothing, since the egalitarian conformity of democracy actually impedes the free commingling of races. It is the lower class among the whites who hate and fear the Negroes the most. The nervous mingling and the self-conscious inclusion of Negro men and women in public institutions and public entertainment means little. More important, there is some evidence to the effect that, except on the fringes of Bohemia, the number of marriages between Negroes and whites may not be increasing, all of the public preaching and propaganda of sexual freedom notwithstanding. Of course, the distinction of the races would diminish if the number of children from mixed marriages increased, but the number of mulattoes in the United States is hardly increasing at all. In certain states of the South, it was not inconsiderable 100 years ago. In some, the two races live apart, as before, and in certain important ways, are even more apart than before. That this is mostly due to the barbaric prejudices of white Americans is largely, though, alas, not always, nonsense. And those Europeans who claim that they cannot understand the stubborn persistence of racial apartness in the United States ought to keep quiet and thank their good fortune for their own lack of experience. It is easy for a Frenchman to point out the racial liberalism in evidence in the cafes of the left bank. Were there 1,000,000 blacks living in Paris, the liberalism of the Parisians would yet have to be demonstrated. During the last 10 years, however, an important change occurred in the mental disposition of American Negroes, the meaning of which goes beyond their discontent with the erratic and sometimes overdue legal enforcement of some of their civic rights. For the first time, millions of them claim that the white majority, with all of its rights, ways, culture, and civilization, is no longer to be emulated. For centuries, the Negroes dreamed of becoming like the whites, to the point of imitating not only the clothes, but the physical appearance of the whites. Now, many of them are trying to convince themselves that this aspiration is not merely impossible, but that it is also undesirable. My blackness goes deeper than the color of my skin. This, in brief, is the condition that certain thinking Negroes have discovered within themselves, having looked deeper into themselves than their ancestors earlier. Thus, Negroes, too, have been influenced by the evolving internalization of the human condition in the Western world, and the tragic, the sometimes horrible and sometimes ludicrous excrescences of this assertion of their identity, bursting forth in the civil disorders of the last few years, ought not to obscure the significance of this condition. The tragedy of the American Negroes, and also of whites, then, is that this far from ignoble aspiration is practically unachievable. For in spite of their factual exaltation of Muslimhood or of Africa, the American Negroes have no Zion whereto they may return. Their language is English. Their entertainments, and consequently much of their everyday imagination, are American. They are condemned, if that is the word, to live in the United States. There they dwell, crowding into their narrow interstices between the white American population. because of the decaying urbanity in American aspirations, they come to occupy, here and there, more and more sections of American cities that are abandoned by whites. But a truly meaningful secession into a Negro community, a state within the United States, is impossible. Still, this self-assertion of their separate identity is an important event, marked as it is, on the one hand, by the occasional reappearance of savagery in the midst of civilization. On the other hand, it marks the end of an epoch of intellectual illusions. It suggests, temporarily or not, the waning prestige of the white race, and it exemplifies a development that is now crystallizing everywhere in the world. Here, again, we encounter the dual development of integration and disintegration. On the one hand, the world has become compact. Every race has some contact with another. In many places of the world, the members of different races are mingling freely. It seems as if the world were becoming one world after all. Footnote. The recent interest of white people in the cultures and artifacts of Africans and Asians would be an admirable thing in itself, a symptom of the broadening of minds and of perceptions, were it not that many among the professional practitioners of non-Western studies seem to be little more than intellectual opportunists, whose interests in alien cultures is hardly genuine. It is rather the outcome of their ignorant disinterest in the history of the culture that should have been their own. End of footnote. On the other hand, the world is breaking up into vast racial regions. The various races are beginning to be sovereign within their own regions, somewhat like the nationalities of Europe that began to form themselves into natural states toward the end of the Middle Ages. Except for the Americas and Australia, the white race has returned to Europe. Africa belongs to Africans, Asia more and more to Asians. There remains the huge question of Russia's empire in northern Asia. At the end of the last century, Bismarck was supposed to have said that the most important fact in the 20th century would be that Americans speak English. It is not impossible that the most important condition of the next 100 years might be that the Russians are, after all, white. The civilization that is spread out from Europe and America now rules the world. But the prestige of the white race has become afflicted, while its proportion of the population of the globe is diminishing too, at a slower rate than most people believe, principally because of high birth rates in Latin America. The coexistence of different races in the world is now a fact, but the question remains, what kind of coexistence? Alas, it is possible that before the racial geography of the globe crystallizes anew, like 500 years ago, when the political geography of Europe was crystallizing, large popular wars might erupt, with entire peoples of different races rushing at each other. In the chronic conflicts of our decades between Arabs and Israelis, in Vietnam between Russia and China, it is foolish to slur over the element of racial struggle beneath the ideological or political or economic claims, more than often pretexts. On the other hand, it is not impossible that such a murderous worldwide struggle among races might not take place, precisely because of their separate consolidation in different regions of the globe. In that event, our descendants will smile at the modern illusion, the belief that masses of different races will coexist peacefully within the same nation, under the same government, elected by themselves, and that with their increasing consciousness, their distinctness will disappear.